Okay, in that case, I will open it up for general questions and discussions for the all the presenters and for each other. Anyone with a question? Remember, how about if I ask you a couple of questions? Yesterday, we talked about a number of influences on trust, such as cultural influences, political influences, celebrity scientists, and each of you have touched a little bit on one or the other aspects of this. Here in the audience, do you have any thoughts or questions or comments related, for example, to cultural influences that might be relevant to these three case studies? Oh boy. Well, okay.
So we're all lulled into the after lunch doldrums
I believe.
I don't want to pick on people, but David, you had some interesting points to raise around this, I think particularly with the white male evangelical group. I don't know if you want to, not to call you out, but I don't know if you want to be called
but you're
out
being
on that, to elaborate on that aspect. I thought was quite interesting.
So there is a group of people that were identified by Tony Lazarowitz at Yale.
Identified as what?
This is a work that was done at Yale by Tony Lazarowitz, and he calls them environmental naysayers. They tend to be male, religious conservatives, politically conservative. And so when you test these people against a wide range of ideas, it could be nuclear energy, mad cow disease, nanotech, they're just not worried about them, right? So the interesting thing was what happens when they were in groups and tested around synthetic biology, where the concerns flipped around completely. So there was something about biology, biology touching life, this whole issue of playing God, that really changed this group. So it really changes the dynamics of polarization. So when you're thinking about, how do you engage people, you have to think a little bit about what's going on. Each one of these has its own set of dynamics. And you can't just assume because you had a group that was identified as pro-tech or against tech, that's going to sort of stay through all of the technologies. So they may respond differently to cognitive neuroscience interventions. I don't know, but I think it gets back to this idea that Erica had, is there's just need to kind of constantly go back and I think check our assumptions and not assume what we know about a particular group and how they respond to a particular scientific or technological intervention is going to work the next time. Because you do get these kind of interesting flips, and it has really large implications about who do you engage, how do you engage them, how are they covered in the press, what kind of influence do they have, how can they be energized or mobilized by non-governmental groups. The entire kind of sort of the political debate kind of goes back to being able to build coalitions, and the sort of the bricks of the coalition change around. So I think this idea of going back and always sort of saying, do what we knew from the focus groups the last time, does that work again? Because I don't think it always does. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Laura or Mary, would you like to we had a similar discussion. I was in the vaccine group, and actually there was a similar thread.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about, in the vaccine group, about different audiences and the way that those messages might be perceived with those different audiences, and thinking about how, so I think we got around to the point where we recognized very quickly that, when people first think about people who have concerns about vaccines, they often think of people who have very, very, very strong feelings about vaccines and are vehemently anti-vax. And they tend to fall into groups that are, conspiracy theory oriented. And so I think we got to the point where we decided that the things that scientists could do to increase trust oftentimes really weren't addressing that particular group. That we were focused on a group of people that tended to be more in the the questioning or uncertain camp, but might not, but are still could be persuaded one way or the other, and still are influenceable, rather than people who have very stark ideas and can always, that's the beauty of conspiracy theories, right? You can always come up with a conspiracy theory to trump the evidence that's being presented to you. And so I think that, yeah, part of what we discussed in the context of vaccines was also thinking about different audiences and how different messages might be more or less effective with those different audiences, and how and who might communicate to those audiences, and what they might say might change based on those circumstances.
Thank you. Mary? One thing that I recall was that, very similar to your point, which was that there are other hot button science issues, and you can't predict from someone's views on one issue what their views on vaccination might be. So you might, and just what you said is that it's really important to test our assumptions about people's general worldviews and thoughts. Any more comments? Erica, you were about to say something.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about the 3 topics that were picked is in vaccines, there's a clear kind of outcome. We want people to be vaccinated. There's a public health outcome. And I think in the breast cancer screening, we want people to, again, have good health. They both have sort of public health and individual health issues, whereas synthetic biology is kind of a different animal in that sense. And it's really about how do we have a discussion that moves forward that gets us to a place where we all have a comfort with this, and so that it aligns with our societal values. I think it's a little bit of a different place and a little different discussion, and I find that that's an interesting contrast between kind of thinking about trust issues around that, because it really came down to, we want, in synthetic biology, it's not about sort of health and public health, trust matters. It's really about, are people going to trust scientists? Are they going to trust all of us to be in a conversation that's open, so that we're doing science in a way that aligns with the values of society, and we're not doing things that perhaps are considered unethical or considered kind of outside the bounds of societal norms. So I think that that's kind of an interesting difference between the 3 topics.
Barry has a comment, and then...
Well, you were first.
Oh, okay. Please.
Okay. Well, I guess I have 2 questions going 2 different directions. One is, all of you basically came to 2 major points. One is you have to have a credible, eloquent, concise spokesperson who is listened to. And the other is that we have to have better stories to tell to be able to describe this in a credible way. And so how do we as a community do that? How do we build this cadre of people? How do we build this cache of stories? And who does that? And how do we organize around that? Is that the societies, or is it individual institutions? So that's one line of question. But the other was sort of triggered by what Laura, I think you said, and that is, how much do we even worry about the outliers? If there's conspiracy theorists and the hardliners on either end, do you even worry about them? And this is maybe for the comms people in the room. Or do you just worry about making sure you're engaging that central 80%, and because they will carry the story? That may not be the right assumption. So I'm really intrigued about that, worrying about the outliers when, in fact, maybe that's too much energy spent. But maybe those are the very ones you have to tackle because they're the ones who are noisy. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. So.
Would you like to go ahead, Mary?
I'd love to. I don't want to jump on what you were going to say, Barry, but should I just respond to this? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So a couple of thoughts on your, I thought, excellent questions. So one, I would certainly say that having a spokesperson isn't necessary. In fact, it's better to have many. And they don't even need to be pitch perfect, memorized lines. Of course, it's helpful to share the same concepts. But I think for the science community to come across as, and it was discussed earlier today, as warm and competent, and I care about you, I'm engaged with you, means, conveying all those things means you have to listen to the person you're talking to or group. You have to know something about them, and you may not just be, you shouldn't be, I would say, reciting chapter and verse from the approved story on this topic. And to me, whose job it is to develop those things is really, it's the job of everybody in the science community, which gets back to education of scientists and to the institutions that carry the imprimatur of science, whether it's the national academies, the Royal Society, whomever, or the scientific societies, to make it everybody's business in the science community, to have, to develop comfortable ways to engage with non-scientists. And it is not for everybody to be on television doing that, but it is for everybody to learn how to be more engaged with the non-science community and to know also where to go to get some information that is reliable to transmit, even when it isn't on your particular topic. And that can be done. I don't think that's impossible to do. On your other question, and I'm sure people have other views on the first one and this one as well, about the outliers. I think to have a sort of SWAT team group that's always worried about the outliers is a wise strategy across the scientific enterprise. And let's use the animal rights crowd. There's NEIGHBOR and FBR, groups that are solely focused on combating animal rights activists and helping the various members of the science community who periodically and predictably, predictable in that it will happen, not necessarily when and where, are going to be confronted with animal rights activists. So there is a kind of SWAT team approach to the true outliers. I think that makes sense. But I don't think the balance of the conversation or the expectations of the science community should be to always be talking about the responsible conduct of research with animals as part of everything they say. I think that can be dealt with in a separable way. And similarly, I don't think we have to be talking, all of us, about climate change every day or vaccines every day or screening or synthetic biology. But for things that have been, where there's a known group of hostile anti-folks, they should be dealt with that way, strategized and dealt with that way.
Thank you. Phyllis.
I wanted to answer the first part of her question. If you don't engage the people who are actually engaging the public and bring them to the table and listen to them, and those of us who do have science backgrounds and who are cognizant of what is going on, who do attend conferences and who do go and look for the current information, if you don't engage us and bring us here, more of us, to tell you how the message is being presented and what we need help with, and ask us or show us or converse with us, I think you talking to yourselves ends up with you talking to yourselves.
I'd certainly agree with that. I mean, I take the use all the time the maxim from the disability community of nothing about us without us. I think the science community needs to take that very seriously in engaging the non-science public all the time, from the beginning of even conceptualizing about a current or emerging science problem all through the end. So I couldn't agree more.
Well, Mary, though, she was specifically identifying an important, what would you call, cog, right? Because she was representing people who are doing the communication, who are scientifically trained, and who are actively engaged in the public, whose job it is to go back and forth. And is there a specific way of engaging them, do you think? Am I accurately paraphrasing?
I'm not sure I understand.
I think Mary understood.
Oh,
but
okay,
it's
then I
also-
misunderstood.
No, but you also understood because we need to be there at the beginning.
Yes.
I had the opportunity to be there with NCI when it was NCI DCLG under Dr. Nita Huber, and we had the chance then to start the input on how things were going to be seen on the outside because we were there. And when it comes to the actual research and the science, yes, we need to be there, and the participant who's going to be in the research project should be there. Not that it directs it, no, but when you say you're going to do 6 mammograms a month in your clinical trial, and it has made it to at least my committee, and I turn to my breast cancer survivor and say, will you do that? Can you do that? You know, it's not well thought out. But then when you communicate that to the public, and how you communicate that to the public, if I don't know what's going on, and then be able to ask the question to the PI, to the research group, to the National Academy of Sciences, what do I do?
Yeah.
And get the feedback so that I have the chance to figure out how to disseminate that to the different populations, because there are many different populations out there. If I'm the only one here and we don't have more, then you're just talking to yourselves.
And when you work on these projects, do you follow the practice, like Kathleen's suggestion of testing out one message, testing out another message, developing the
You
right?
have to.
Yeah.
You have to. It has to be that diverse, because not one message works for everyone.
Yeah, I'm an anthropologist, and I certainly find that something very simple
And
that
it can be done.
yes, it can be.
It absolutely can be done. Yes, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes the challenge, and it takes the failure so that you know what does work. There's nothing wrong with failure.
We learn. Barry.
One question was identifying the people who can serve as the point spokespersons, and that's not an easy job. We try at the National Cancer Institute. We have an Office of Media Relations, showing our devotion to the importance of the topic. But one of the things they do is develop a list of people who are interested in speaking to journalists and the public, but that's not enough. They have to really be trained, and the training can be painful, because a lot of people who think they're great communicators, or not everyone who thinks they're a great communicator is a great communicator, and it can be a painful experience to answer a question on video and then be told, if you gave me enough time, I could probably identify 10 people in the world who understand what you just said. We got to go through this again. Let me ask you the question again. And you go over and over. And that's very helpful. And and it's my perception, others can certainly disagree, that often communications, the people who are doing research on communications, are doing research on how to beef up the message to be as strong as possible. So it doesn't matter what the message is, you just pick the topic off the shelf from the PR group at the university or whatever, and you just tone it up so it's going to be the strongest possible. And we have to break that mold. We actually have to make sure that our communicators are matching the strength of the message with the strength of the evidence, as I said. Our Office of Media Relations is working on, I hope it'll come to pass, a media training curriculum, so that we learn from the media, they learn from us what their needs are, what our needs are. I do have a question, though, to the vaccine group, Mary's group. One stark difference between vaccination and screening is that screening principally affects the person being screened, for the good or the bad or both. Vaccines potentially affect the person, but many other people, because of the issue of herd immunity. And I'm guessing maybe that we haven't done enough research on that. Some people, it may tip the balance if they realize that their decision not to vaccinate their child may affect an immunocompromised child in the school, in the class, who can't be immunized because it would be dangerous for them to get a live vaccine. And also, some parents have made the decision, all I have to do is depend on herd immunity, not eradication, but if enough children in my class, in my son's or a child's class are vaccinated, I don't have to worry about it because there is this herd immunity. So it seems to me that there's plenty of room for working with that concept that only applies to vaccine or infectious diseases, to either heighten the awareness of citizenship or let them know that you can't depend on herd immunity and not get vaccinated.
Well, we certainly talked about that quite a bit. I would not say that we came to any new recommendations, but I would, correct me if I'm wrong, people in our group, but we spoke about the importance of talking it up more education, which is just the same thing you're saying there in this space, but recognizing that there's, there is ultimately that tension between parental choice, if you will, what I want for my child and my family, and the public health decision, up to and including, your pediatrician's recommendation, the ability or lack thereof for your child to go to school. There is a tension there. It's always going to be one, but that talking about it more helps. And again, it's that self-identifying part where you don't want to be presumably exposing the baby that lives next door, who's not old enough to get vaccines yet, to your child who you chose not to have vaccinated. And that's a life and death kind of decision. So personalizing it, getting it down to the individual level rather than at the herd, we actually decided that maybe that concept spoken of in that way is not very user-friendly to people. So, but the person next door is another story. Yeah.
Thank you. Sir.
In the synthetic biology working group, we made a decision not to spend any time talking about the so-called do-it-yourself biology movement or community, if it is a community. I don't know if it counts as a community. And fair enough, because the concerns, questions about that are distinct from synthetic biology as a whole. Nonetheless, the fact, it seems to me that the fact that many people who have been prominent as pioneers in synthetic biology, as we understand that, the modern incarnation, shall we say, of synthetic biology, are involved in the do-it-yourself biology movement. It seems to me it bears noting that that does raise a whole lot of different questions than are raised by synthetic biology as practiced by large corporations, as practiced by governments. And I'll say no more than that, without being judgmental about it. If we're thinking about public perceptions, it might not be too much of a stretch to call it a potential liability, to have a lot of people trying to do things now with a lot more power than they had in the past, worth thinking about.
Would you define the do-it-yourself community for the community here?
Well, the basic idea is that the modern technologies within synthetic biology are such that it is much simpler than it was a decade ago or decades ago to do genetic manipulations of different kinds and to develop technologies. And not quite, the basement is probably, an exaggeration, but you don't need as much equipment and as much space and as many people to do quite interesting things with genetic engineering. And you can order the parts that you need from the BioBricks Foundation. And again, I'm sure that the vast majority of people who are engaging in this kind of thing are responsible and well-intentioned, but it does give me pause to think about that technology getting into so many more places, and perhaps it is worth thinking about.
Any comments on the DIY biology community? Any of you up here?
So it's true. I mean, I have a $400 PCR machine on my desk with a gel box, so I can actually extract, amplify, and do DNA analysis in my office. I can go on to eBay and just search under synthesis machines, right? You can get a whole bunch of them for about $1,000 now. So I think the issue here is not to be afraid of it, but I think the issue is that it's an incredible challenge to the existing governance system we have, because the governance system works well in places that, in companies and universities and whatnot. But now we have a bunch of people that are innovating in an open network, and they're readily sharing information. It's open IP, it's the gift economy. So I think, yes, we should be worried about it, but I think it's also probably one of the most interesting challenges that face anybody that's doing public policy work. Sort of, how do you deal with this? And how do you provide sort of an interface between these emergent networks where you can have enormous amounts of innovation? I mean, you talk about people that are getting folks excited about biology. It's these folks. Right? And we're worried about STEM education. This place that's contagious, right? What's going on? So you want this to happen, but how do you make sure it happens in a safe way? So I think, yes, you worry about it, but the worrying you shouldn't just worry about it. You should worry about it in a creative sense, because it's an opportunity to rethink exactly how we think about biosecurity and biosafety outside of the traditional models. So I think there's both a challenge and an opportunity.
Interesting. So it might take very 21st century techniques and strategies to involve that group. At least that was my impression from it. You said it's very open, it's sharing, it's the gift economy. That sounds like they're in contact with the internet or with each other or whatever, but not through professional societies or meetings like this. Is that right?
I'll give you one. So they don't have access to biosafety officers. Most universities, if you're doing biology in a university, you've got a biosafety officer. So one of the things we did was we went to the American Biosafety Officer Society and we said, would you be willing to talk to these people? And we got a bunch of people in universities to volunteer. We set up a website so that the DIY bio folks can actually put questions in there. They were anonymized. We were all set to basically launch this thing, and the universities came back and said, we're not going to insure these people. So we actually had to go to Lloyd's of London and get an insurance policy, which cost us $5,000 a month. And now the system runs. Right? So it's basically, these DIY bio folks, if they have a question about, a lot of the questions are kind of, can I transport this? Can I compose? It's simple things that the biosafety officers, they run into all the time.
No.
They can basically put them into the website. They get an answer back. It goes into FAQs, so there's a whole history. But it also tells us a lot about what these folks are doing. And so you want to keep the system open. But it's a way of kind of transcending this gap between where's the expertise in biosafety in the universities and what do these people need. Right?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting challenge. The problem was an insurance policy we bought. So.
You mean ensuring the people giving the advice?
Yeah, because the university said, no, we don't want you giving advice to the people in the garages. We're not going to insure that, right?
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. George.
George Matsumoto. I had sort of a very general question based on lunchtime conversations and listening to the three of you with the banner behind you about does the public trust science? And one of the things that Kerry mentioned yesterday was that trust is not about thinking like me. And I started thinking about that with these breakout groups, because really what all three of the breakout groups were addressing were, what do we do with all those people who don't think like me? And it occurred to me that maybe those people that don't think like us are not really distrustful of science, particularly in the vaccine group that I was in, is they're picking their science from what I would perceive as maybe not the right source. But maybe not. I mean, is this really a problem that not everybody in the world thinks exactly the same way about all these issues? Are they, I mean, not all scientists agree on all these issues. And so maybe some of these people who are thinking differently than us are following the scientists who think differently than us. And so, you know, if we come back to the purpose of this workshop, does the public trust science? They're trusting science. They're just not trusting my science or your science. And I don't know, is that something that we need to focus on? Is that something that is important? Or is that something that we should just accept as this is a free society and we get to decide who we want to follow and what we want to do?
Well, you want to go ahead? George, I think it's a great question to raise. I mean, one of the observations I have is that, especially because of the internet, where people have the ability, whether they're scientists or non-scientists, to watch science in almost real time. You know, it's way different than a couple decades ago, where it's just when the science is done, or the project anyway is done, then you get the report on it. Now it's for people who want to, they literally can watch things in very close to real time, so they have a lot of questions. And I think that's healthy. I think when non-science members of the public ask questions about science, if they're being skeptical, they're acting like scientists. And I think we should run toward that rather than away from it, and say, wow, rather than being, you know, assaulted by it or question it or demean it, say, you're thinking like a scientist thinks. You're asking questions, because we don't ever know the ultimate answer. You know, there are very few science questions that are settled for all time, forever. So it's a way to welcome people in and to make it clear that we don't know the answers to everything yet, and that it's healthy to have questions. And now that doesn't solve the immediate public health problem or the immediate biosecurity problem, but it might create a friendlier conversation and ultimately a partnership in doing the best we can in the public's interest, knowing what we know now. Right?
So I think this is a topic that was a very lively discussion in the SynBio group, and I'd encourage some of the folks in the audience that I know were speaking on behalf of the public in the room, that the scientists might not get the outcome to these dialogues that they want. That, if we're going into the dialogue with the public around this field with the attitude that we want to sell it to them, and we want them to think that it's a good thing, that in fact, when we look at some of the applications, the scientists don't, may or may not agree on that as well, and the public may not either. And that unless the scientific community goes into these discussions with very much an open attitude that they're going to value all of the participants in this conversation, that bring down the answers, that the outcomes and the expectations that are being set need to be met. So if you go into the public and have a discussion and say, we want to have an open discussion about where your comfort level is on this science, and their comfort level is not where the scientists are, then what are you going to do with that you move forward? You say, well, that's nice for us to know, roll forward, or that's nice for us to know, we're going to pull back and talk more, or we're going to pull back and not do that area. I mean, I think that's part of that trust, is that you can't have this conversation and go in and with the presupposing what the answer to the dialogue is and what the outcome of that dialogue is. Sometimes it may not wind up being what you wanted. We definitely had, I think, some tension in the room as the discussion went on, because it was, I think it was raised point to Tim in the back there. It's like, what are we trying to do here? Are we having a dialogue because we want to sell this technology? Are we having a dialogue because we want to have an honest dialogue? And I think it was a really, really great point to raise in the room, because I think when you get a group like this of scientists and science communicators and people that are in the scientific field, it's hard to not feel a little bit of boosterism for science. It's kind of, I think, innate in a lot of who the people in the room are. It's just we happen to be we like science, So it's a little hard for us as a group to overcome that group think. It's important for us to do that. You know.
And I'm about to give you my own personal opinion because, at least in my recall, we didn't get into that in our breakout session in terms of trying to get people to think like we do, because most of our emphasis was making sure that the people are given the opportunity and respect to follow their own values and not to impose them with our perception of what the outcome should be. But there is this perhaps unspoken assumption that there are certain rules in science and certain things that exclude areas from science. I'm going to guess that there's not a whole lot of emphasis at the National Academy of Sciences on how to improve the methods in paranormal studies, and the same thing and that becomes an impossible engagement because there has to be, at some level, an agreement of what science is and the methods that have served us well. Now, if you come across people who simply don't accept that, and occasionally you do, then there isn't much room for engagement at all. But that's not generally the audience. I have to believe that's a, you know, there's a whole book on that, the unpersuadables. There's always going to be some unpersuadables, and sometimes it's because there's not even an acceptance of the ground rules of what constitutes science, period.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Shrine from the National Science Foundation. I would like to bring up a somewhat new topic. I am a PhD scientist who's working as a science writer, and I would like to therefore raise the issue that I understand it's practical and functional to use the terms the public, scientists, and science communicators, but we can't forget that there should actually be overlap between those circles, but also in a time when it's getting, in some fields, more and more difficult for STEM PhDs to find academic jobs, I really think we have to seriously consider the science communication training that we're giving science graduate students so that they can effectively pursue alternative careers. Well, I hate to even use the term alternative careers, but non-tenure track faculty type positions once they graduate, so they can be scientist communicators, not just science communicators. Thanks.
Thank you. Comment.
Oh, I completely agree with that. I think there's so many reasons that it would be beneficial to individuals during their education as well as to society writ large for scientists, as they're being trained, to learn how to communicate more effectively with non-scientists. There's no downside to it almost, no matter what else that individual goes on to do, and it's a benefit to all of society. So how that gets changed, I am not in the position to change the curriculum of graduate science education, but maybe the academy could have some influence. You know.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm Tim Schwab from Food and Water Watch. I wanted to thank the commenter who mentioned that there are different kind of publics in different sciences. And that's one comment I made in the synthetic biology breakout session, is that, you know, there were times where my feeling was that we were trying to find ways to brand and to sell SynBio and not to make it the next GMO. And I think it just seems premature to have that conversation when, you know, the public really hasn't been engaged in this. There's absolutely no regulations over SynBio. You're seeing commercialization of these products. And that just, if anything, that seems like a recipe for distrust. So, you know, to kind of frame a conversation around how do we, you know, generate trust out of the public. And that's kind of, I guess, a bigger sort of observation I've had the last couple of days, is a lot of the conversation seems to be thinking about this kind of unspecified anonymous public and the kind of, you know, the quirks or the, you know, whether it's a superstition or religiosity, and that's what's in their way of embracing this technology. or whether it's just that they're not educated. And so it seems like a lot of the conversation is framed around how do scientists talk to the public? But in focusing on that, I think that you do miss some salient points about science itself and the problems with science itself. A presenter yesterday brought up a couple good examples, one of which was the back and forth, contradictory, peer-reviewed science on the benefits of chocolates, the problems with chocolate, the benefits of wine, the problems with wine. He also mentioned conflicts of interest, where when industry sponsors research, it routinely produces favorable results to industry. The words he used, there's a vast body of scientific literature showing that to be the case, and that is true. But there really isn't a meaningful conversation in most scientific fields. I work on food and agricultural policy, and that conversation really isn't really happening in any meaningful way in academics, for example. And you see, any of these industrial products, whether it's an animal drug, whether it's a GMO, there really isn't, or you see a huge amount of industrial money going into the science, and oftentimes there isn't a counterpoint to that in the scientific literature, and oftentimes there's also not disclosure about it. And so I think that creates like a clear way for trust to be broken between the public and the scientific community. It's a really relevant issue on the subjects that I work on. It's gotten some address in the last couple of days, but I think it needs a much bigger platform. It's just one example of the way that I think scientists aren't doing themselves a favor by really embracing this new kind of era of industrial money, industrial support for research. Thank you.
How would you fit that in? I believe, Erica, you mentioned, and someone else mentioned, the UK model of engagement. Did I hear that wrong?
I did mention that. I don't know that this necessarily fits into that. But
Okay, maybe it doesn't.
That it came up in my group with it. But just to respond in a general sense, some of the speakers yesterday talked about, we need people to understand the nature and process of science, and which is something I've heard since I got into science communication in the mid-90s. It's like, if only people understood the nature and process of science, then they'd understand how all this stuff works. And it's not that easy people don't really necessarily want to engage about the nature and process of science. But I think one of the things that I've always find a little bit of a tension in that discussion is there's the nature and process of science idealized, and then there's the nature and process of science as is actually done. And I think that scientists, when they say they want people to understand the nature and process of science, they want that idealized, there's the hypothesis, and we test it, and then we get to, And it's not that, I get money from over here, and then I publish it over here, and I actually have pressures here to put it in this journal. And it's a lot messier than what the kind of idealized version is. And I think sometimes scientists are not necessarily comfortable with the non-idealized version, which is why I think sometimes these conversations, it's almost like a blind spot sometimes, I think, for people in science, because we do kind of aspire, and I think maybe all humans do in their thing, we aspire to be better than what we actually are. And I think that's one of the places where we kind of have a tension in what you're talking about. I don't know what people think about that.
Barry?
Yes, so you've raised a critical point, which was not the focus of our breakout group, but it's very, very important. And this is what, the nature of science, and what are the problems, not gaining the trust of the public, but problems with reproducibility. You alluded to that. The whipsaw literature, this week coffee kills, next week it cures, and the week after that. So that's a problem within the field of science. And if we don't get a handle on reproducibility of science, not only aren't we going to get the trust of the public, we don't deserve the trust of the public. Because science is only worthwhile to the extent that it is reproducible, and it makes predictions that are testable. And there are problems amongst our own, and there are study designs you can tell are designed for reproducibility, and there's certain fields that are more prone to problems with reproducibility, and certain fields that have lower positive predictive values and lower predictive values, the two underpinnings of all of science, reproducibility and predictive power. And we work very hard in my division. Some of it is measurement error. You know, why would the same food kill you this week and save you next week? Or why was John Ioannidis able to take a Boston cookbook and go through the first 50 ingredients and discover that 3/4 of the ingredients, or 2/3, had been associated with cancer, almost always in different directions. You know, he said, "Is everything associated with cancer?" was the title of the paper. If we don't get a handle on that, and we work very hard at that, but that's not a topic that came up much here. In our division, I have a whole team of biometrists working on measurement error in physical activity, measurement error in dietary assessment, because if we don't do that, we're never going to cure the problem of lack of reproducibility.
The only thing I would add to that is that I think it's critical that there's independence also. If you have a company, you know, producing science about their own product, and they produce many studies which show consistently their product's good, how valuable is that, you know, and how much trust should the public have in those results? And unfortunately, on a lot of topics I work on, that's the state of the science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I see what you're saying, and I have to say, as I said yesterday, every system delivers exactly what it was designed to do. So when we made decisions about funding research out of the public sector, and Mary, I can see her shaking already, that was a decision that inevitably would lead to different funding streams. It had to, because we had already trained a cadre of scientists. There was no way of shutting that down, and scientists want to survive. And so it may have been a rational decision, but it definitely changed the types of questions that would be asked, and it definitely started to pour over into topics that you are suggesting.
Thank you.
Could I just jump in? I really think the points that were just raised are incredibly important, and we shouldn't lose track of them, whether we call it apparently contradictory science. You know, to me, that's gets back to seeing science in real time. Science is contradictory as it proceeds. It's not a linear process. And being able to talk to non-scientists about that when you've got the example right before your eyes. So yesterday chocolate was good, today it's bad. It's a wonderful teaching moment, a teachable moment, if you will, that we shouldn't run away from but should run toward. And transparency, another thing that came up here, hugely important. For, you know, not hiding, and sometimes I think the science community is hiding things it doesn't mean to be hiding, but it just historically has over the years. And more transparency is sunlight. It is going to help. It's also, I think, useful for scientists to convey and say explicitly, I work for you. I serve the public's interest. And think through what that means, because that if you're explicitly saying to a member of the public that you're the boss, you know, I work for you, you ought to be able to answer a lot of questions about it, easy ones as well as hard ones. You know, like what are you doing today or tomorrow? But why is it important? How does it get funded? Connecting dots for people would be a huge service to the science community, I believe, rather than hanging out from that question or implicitly implying that the way that I work for you is that I'm doing science and someday I'll get the Nobel Prize and you will applaud.
Yeah. I would also like to add to that something that Kathleen made a comment about yesterday, and that is explaining what the evidence is and what the gaps are. And I'm just thinking, often if you see one chocolate kills, chocolate doesn't kill, the studies are asking really very different questions of very different people, and their measure of chocolate and their measure of kill is very different. And so to that, it also then behooves us and to explain that. Rick.
So I'm Rick Borchelt, Department of Energy, Office of Science, and I want to, I think, give a little bit of perspective that's relevant to this last question, which was a very good set of questions and discussions about this workshop. And it won't surprise anyone who's been involved in these workshop proceedings before that the hardest thing we had to do, and we spent weeks, was figuring out what to call the workshop. And we did not decide to call it How to Increase Support for Science by Increasing Trust. And that's for a very, very good reason. There are lots of reasons why someone may be an anti-vaxxer. There are many reasons why someone may not be supportive of synthetic biology. There are many reasons why people may oppose mammography guidelines of one kind or another. What this workshop, I hope, was designed to do, or what it was designed to do, and whether or not it did, is, I think, up to you guys to tell us whether that happened or not, is all other things being equal, we don't want lack of trust in science to be the deciding reason why someone figures out one of these. It could be ideology, it could be partisanship, it could be any of a number of other things, but lack of trust in the scientists, in science as an enterprise, or in scientific institutions should not be the deciding factor on any of these issues. And that's why I think what I would like to sort of to push this conversation to is, we can all support a greater increase in trust in science without believing it will necessarily lead to greater support for the particular science we're talking about. The two are not mutually exclusive. And we can always have room for discussion and dialogue and disagreement. We just want to make sure that that's done with perfect trust, as perfect as possible between the folks who are in dialogue or in conversation. And I'll just allow you guys to have some thoughts about that.
Any thoughts? Well, we haven't talked about biological influences. Is Rose still here? The only suggestion that my group came up with was bring a puppy. But and we were thinking about the science cover of a couple of weeks ago where it said, gazing into your dog's eye increases oxytocin levels. What about celebrity science? Declan, were any comments about these and celebrity science? Certainly for breast cancer screening, you've got an example with Angelina Jolie.
Yeah, so that's a very complicated question that we face, and it's what I have periodically referred to as the numerator-denominator issue. Your worldview changes. We all hope we're going to stay in that denominator until the day we drop dead. But over time, most of us pop into one or another numerator. And that suddenly changes our perspective of what is important and what other people should do. And so you get people who become evangelical if they have access to the microphone and they speak well in a specific area. And the problem is once you're already in the numerator, it doesn't determine what you should have done in the denominator.
Yeah.
And so all it means is you've been identified, and it doesn't mean that you become an expert in the denominator. And there are a lot of trade-offs in the denominator, and the risk-benefit ratio changes dramatically. That's why specialists have a far different view of guidelines than generalists do. And I'm not talking about finances and flow of income. I'm talking about the world view of a specialist. If you see nothing but end-stage renal failure, you have a different set of what the problems out there are than if you see thousands of healthy people, some of whom have a minor elevation in one of their renal function tests. And so you are likely to make different recommendations or decisions and whatever because of the numerator-denominator issue. That's what I've always said, by the way. And I mid-career, decided I didn't know enough. I'd been trained in the numerator. I had gone to pretty good places to train me in that numerator. I was pretty good, but not great, in the numerator. There was always more to learn. But I came to the realization that I knew almost nothing about the denominator, and in order to be a full physician, I wanted to know about both. So I went back to School of Public Health and got a master's degree in public health. And I've often said that I didn't learn one single thing in the School of Public Health that I should not have been taught in medical school. And yet it was all new to me. And so that changed my view. So for the first time, instead of seeing cancer patient after cancer patient after cancer patient, I suddenly realized either I am restricted, have been restricted to the numerator, and that's where my mindset has been. And I have to be formally trained in the denominator, and that really is a useful thing for the public. But the same thing happens to people, because physicians are no better, hopefully no worse, than the average population. And the average population goes around the numerator and then suddenly finds himself in the, in the denominator, suddenly finds himself in the numerator, and those aren't necessarily the people with the most insights in the denominator.
Okay, thank you. 2 more quick questions, and then we'll wrap up. Rick will.
Actually, mine isn't really a question. It's more just sharing of information. Kathleen mentioned earlier today a lecture that she did last week at the other National Academies building for the Division of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education. And I just wanted to let people know that you don't actually have to wait for the article that's going to be based on that lecture. It's online. It was videotaped, and you can find it at www.nationalacademies.org /DBAS, which is Division of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education. She touches on lots of the issues that were raised here. I mean, the point about the phrasing used in the CDC communication around elimination of measles being one. She gives several other examples like that. Also talks about things like the importance of science being self-correcting in order to help build trust in science. I would encourage you to have a look at that as well.
Sir.
So I don't know if this is a question either, but it was something that came to mind when Rick was talking, which is, I feel like there's sort of 2 things. There's kind of a trust in whether science writ large or scientists are sincere in what they've done, right? Like, and as opposed to belief that the result they have produced is true, right? Because of the chocolate going back and forth thing, that's not so much that people think the scientists were conspiring to either prove chocolate is bad or wrong, bad or good, but that they just don't know, right? They're just it's complete uncertainty, and they're kind of just, you can't really rely on the science. Whereas I think there's a strain, and at least in certain circles, that the scientists literally aren't trustworthy or can't be trusted, and that there's some sort of conspiracy. You hear this with climate, that the climate scientists can't be trusted, that they I think there was an incident once where someone just told the climate scientist that I don't believe anything you say, and of course we had all these quasi-climate gate where they kind of hacked the computers trying to find some sign of a big conspiracy. And then of course money can be very powerful. Very powerful, distrustful influence that corporate money to a scientist is, making them on the payroll of Monsanto or what have you. So I wonder, like, if there's not some utility in sort of splitting those 2 things apart. There's kind of this active distrust due to either influence of money or perceived. I'm not sure what the motivation is, why climate scientists would be falsifying things, but some sort of perceived bad motive that makes the person distrustworthy, and then sort of this more broader, well, the scientists can't seem to figure out, they don't seem to know what they're doing, right? I mean, like health issues, for example, so I'm just going to believe Dr. Oz instead, or what have you. So I don't know if it's useful to distinguish those 2 kinds.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe go ahead, and then we'll let Rick sum up.
Yeah, one comment about this chocolate problem, or food, or exercise, or God knows what, where there's this whipsaw literature. Some of the problems of scientists, and also their universities and their PR groups and so forth, some of the journalists. But it gets down to, I don't think that in the field of science, this is pointing a figure at scientists, including me, there's sufficient humility. I think a real scientist keeps asking himself or herself every day, how could I be wrong? And be serious about it. How could I be wrong? And I won't declare myself right until I exhaust every possibility that I'm wrong. But what happens in every paper is they say, because they have to, oh, these are the possible confounders, but we actually don't think that that's true. And I have periodically, when the journalists come to me about something we published, I have said, I have no idea why you would even write up this story. There's just no there there. This is one stitch in the growing fabric of information out there. And if I were you, I wouldn't even report on the story. I do that to others too when they call, but I've done it to myself. It's just, this is so incomplete that it's worth being published, otherwise I wouldn't have submitted it, but it's certainly not worth reporting on. I think there's too little of that.
Thank you. And on a note of humility, we'll thank our presenters, and thank you all. And Rick Borcher will give us our benediction.